What was the scariest, we need to leave, now gut feeling that you've ever experienced? Serious. Story 1. Surfing a fairly secluded reef break, offshore across a channel. This place is in a very southern state of Australia, overcast weather, but still, an amazing day for the waves. I was surfing with only one other guy. We were trading waves and getting to know each other in between sets. I asked what he did for a living, and he was a marine biologist. We'd both recently moved to the area and were new to surfing it as well. Despite it being extremely good surf, after 40 minutes he says, "I don't like this. Something feels off. I feel like I'm being watched, like I'm bait." I didn't want to leave as it was excellent surf, but this guy was a marine biologist, so I took his instinct as a sign to play it safe. We paddled back across the deep channel together as quickly as we could without panicking, and walked the 15 minutes trek back to the car park talking shit the whole way. I got his mobile number for future surfs together given how small town it is here and not knowing anyone. We noticed a 15-foot inflatable boat pull up near the reef and hang around for a bit without much thought. Later that night, while looking at my social media, I read about 3 fishermen at the same location we were at that morning, at the same time, in their boat. As they pulled up to check their cray pots on the beach side of the reef, they were circled twice by a great white shark that was as big as their boat. That guy most likely saved me from a horrible experience that day. I messaged him with the link to the Facebook page with the comments regarding their experience. Chills ran through my body for a good 20 minutes. He was adamant he felt the presence of something, and he was right. Story 2. Not my story, but one my mum told me from her 20s when she was living and working in London, United Kingdom. I'll do my best to retell it. Also, I'm dyslexic, so apologies in advance for grammar. This story always gives me the creeps, though, when I think about it. So back in her 20s, my mum was living in London and looking to move into a slightly bigger place. She'd found a really good price for a flat slightly out from the area she was hoping. She'd called the agent to book a viewing, and that's when things turned odd. So the guy booking the viewing started asking weird requests and questions, such as to bring her passport, her age, race, and physical appearance. Would she be coming on her own? Did she have a car, or would she be getting the bus? He was very persistent that she should arrive by bus, as it would be easiest for her, explains it was a straight road down from the bus stop to the apartment block, obviously quite unnerved by this call, but still interested because the flat looked ideal. She and my dad, who were dating at the time, decided to check the exterior and surrounding area. The day before the viewing, they drove there. First passing the bus stop, he was indicating her to arrive via. From the bus stop, there was about 150-200 meters of derelict wasteland that she would have to walk past to get to the flat. And standing at the end of the street in the location this apartment block should have been was a huge abandoned building. Smashed broken windows, graffiti, no entry signs, the lot. Definitely nothing inhabitable in sight. Still, when she tells this today, you can see how much it, rightly, shook her. Of course, she didn't go to her viewing. However, she informed the police advising them of the planned time and place. From what she saw, from following up with them, they didn't appear to take this tip seriously, and little was done. A couple years later, though, while in a pub with some friends, she gets chatting to a guy she just met through mutual friends that night. He was in the police, and through conversation, her story came up. He said that area, at the time of her viewing, had a huge human trafficking problem. Story 3. Me and my little sister went camping in the woods very close to our house when we were kids. We'd seen this bald guy with a blue shirt and a dog walking around, which isn't unusual for the area. You'll often see people walking and say hello. For some reason, though, I just got this tight feeling in my chest, and my sister must have too, because we both just gave each other this look. I don't know what it was that made me do it. This is very out of character for me. But I took a photo of the back of him as he was walking away. A while later, we see the same guy again near the lake. He comes over and asks about the tent we're carrying, where we'll be setting up, and are we camping with our dad? We say yes. We're just going to see him now. A lie. We must have had the same moment of psychicness, because we walked off up a fork in the path until we were out of view, then looked at each other and jumped down a path hidden by the bushes and waited behind them on the parallel trail for a bit. The guy watched us walk off, pretended to play with his dog until he couldn't see us, then turned around and ran up the path after us. Thankfully, he didn't see us hidden and carried on up straight where he thought we'd gone. We decided camping was a bad idea and went home. That evening, my mum shows us a post in the local residents group, which is a picture of the same bald guy trying to break into someone's house. Apparently, he'd just been walking around trying people's front doors and claimed to be a repair guy when he was stopped. I dread to think what his intentions were, but it was very lucky me and my sister knew those woods so well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have thought to go down one of the hidden paths. Story 4. Years ago, before cell phones, I was driving home from dropping my husband at the train at 4:30 a.m. Only me and one other car on the road. He started turning where I turned twice, so I didn't go home. I went to an all-night gas station and called the police. I gave them a description of his car. 3 weeks later, he was arrested. Turns out he was following women home and driving past their house and doubling back to rape them. No one had noticed his car. I'm glad I paid attention. Story 5. My husband used to say, I'm crazy that I do loops around our area if there's a car behind me when I turn off the main road to our little road. I tell him, I'm not having some weirdo follow me home. He got followed by some crazy road rager, once with our son in the car and had to pull a couple U-turns to lose him. He doesn't think I'm crazy anymore. Reply, that's happened to me. I pulled out of a difficult junction where the road dips down, so it's hard to see oncoming traffic when you're coming out. Didn't notice the white van coming up. I didn't even cut him off. It was just a bit too close. Anyway, he tailgated me all the way down the road like a lunatic. Absolutely unhinged for something that was a minor mistake. Luckily, I remembered there was a nearby police station, so practically swerved into this side street on 2 wheels where the station was and pulled into it. That got rid of him. He drove straight past Ha-Ha. I've also driven past my house and doubled back if the same car has been behind me for a while and I'm driving at night. Better to be safe than sorry, and my gran once got followed home at night by suspected muggers because she worked in a shop. Story 6. Years ago, when I was still living at home with the parents, I drove home around 2 a.m. As I parked my car, I noticed a man walking down the street. I decided to wait until he passed my car and was far enough for me to get out. However, instead, he passed my car and hid behind the van that was directly parked behind me. I guess he did not think I was paying attention to him. So I called my dad, who was asleep, to come down and get me. He did, and when the guy saw my dad, he immediately ran away. I was lucky. Story 7. I was in Taco Bell with my daughter, and I saw a guy come in and back out with a t-shirt over his hand. I told her to dump her tray and get moving. We went out to the car quickly and left. Found out later on the news that the guy robbed the place with the gun hiding under his t-shirt. Story 8. When I was about 8, in 1985, an old El Camino pulled up alongside my friend and I with a man saying he knew my mom. He did know her name, but something felt off, so I grabbed my friend and ran. When we told my mom, she went white and called the cops. Turns out this guy thought my mom had stolen his job at the steel mill she worked at the time and wanted to hurt her. He already had a warrant out for nearly killing his wife that morning. When I was 16, my mom had a terrible feeling about an outing some friends and I were going on. Hindsight being 20/20ths, it was a stupid move for me to go anyway, but I did. Long story short, there was a car accident, my 2 best friends died, and I nearly did. It'll be 30 years in November. I still regret getting in that car every day. My friends might still be alive if I hadn't. My mom had that mama spidey sense. She still does. More recently, I was at our other house in the country with my oldest son and his wife and kids. There was a break in the storms, and my son decided to go home instead of spending the night. I was filled with dread at the thought of them going home so late, since we were dealing with intermittent but severe storms. So much dread that I started crying and begging them not to leave. Thankfully, they agreed. We all started home the next morning with them following me and my husband. We came up on this stretch of road that we know has no lights at night to see police barricading a washed-out bridge and cranes retrieving cars. We all piled out of our cars to ask the officers what happened. Apparently, there were several cars that had kept going, not knowing the bridge was out. The lone survivor in the first car had told the police that they went off the bridge at about 9:30 p.m. That's about the time my son wanted to leave. My husband just looked at me, and my boy hugged me extra tight because he knew what could have happened. Story 9. I was 12 at the time, and my favorite thing in the world was spending the night at my grandma's house. We lived in the sticks at the time, and my grandma lived closer to the nearest town. Thursday night was grandma's night. I felt something off one Thursday night and asked my mom if I could just stay home with my mom and dad. They reluctantly agreed. I went home, watched some TV, and went to bed. My bedroom was on the adjoining wall to the living room. I wasn't really asleep, but I heard my mom keep saying my dad's name over and over again with a hint of panic. I sneak out to the living room, and my dad is on the couch with his head tilted back, snoring, really loud, which wasn't uncommon, but my mom was beside him, shaking him and telling him to wake up. She yelled at me to go back to bed. I didn't, obviously. I snuck to their bedroom to call 911. I told the dispatcher that my dad was asleep, and my mom was trying to wake him up, but she couldn't. Eventually, the phone call went to the living room, and my mom talked to the dispatcher. They sent an ambulance to the middle of nowhere. My dad had taken a bottle of diazepam to try to commit suicide. I remember sitting on the floor and holding his hand and repeating over and over that I loved him. The ambulance came and took him to the hospital. Lights and sirens the whole way. We didn't know what happened during that time, but we found out a day or so later, and that is when our world changed. I am very sure if I did not call 911 that night that my dad would have succeeded, and it would have probably driven my mom over the edge as well. And I have no idea why I didn't want to stay the night at my nanny's. I just had that feeling that I needed to go home.
Story 10. When I was a kid, an adult patted my head and I developed an instant inexplicable loathing for him and refused to be alone with him. My parents told me I was being ridiculous and forced me to be around him. He was later sent to prison for abuse of a girl. Reply. Similar thing happened to me. My mom's best friend got a new boyfriend and I immediately hated the guy. Mom asked what I thought of him. I said I thought he was Satan. I was 5 and learning how to read the picture Bible, so that was my only frame of reference to describe evil. Months after this, Mom gets a panicked call from her friend in the middle of the night. She'd come home from work to find the boyfriend passed out in the bathroom with a needle in his arm. When she tried rousing him, he strangled her unconscious. Shortly after this, he kidnapped her and her children at gunpoint and drove them across state lines. Sadly, it was the start of a long, abusive relationship. Story 11. After graduating undergrad, I was working as a caseworker for individuals with developmental disabilities, and got assigned a new case for a young man who had autism and severe behavioral concerns. I met him at his grandmother's house since she had custody of him since his parents weren't around. I think Mom was in prison. Met this young man who was probably about 6 IRO and weighing around 250 pounds, but had the developmental capacity of a 5-year-old child with a hairpin trigger temper. The house he was living in was absolutely destroyed, with the only piece of furniture that was not smashed up was an oversized beanbag chair in the living room. Grandma gave up trying to send the kid to school since he would absolutely destroy the place if he was forced to go. Grandma was no peach, but I felt for her and wanted to help. One of the meetings I was having with them, the kid and Grandma seemed especially tense, like pacing around the room and smacking the walls. After about an hour of trying to get stuff done and realizing that it was not going to happen on this trip, it happens in this line of work, I decided to call it since the kid was becoming more and more agitated. Grandma was annoyed I would have to come back again, but we scheduled for a week or so out and left my business card with a reminder of the appointment. I leave to go back to my home state for a few days, and when I get back, I get called into my supervisor's office. I guess the night I left, the kid had a complete breakdown and beat his grandmother to death. No one noticed until the kid came wandering outside after a day or two covered in blood. I probably missed everything by less than 3 hours. Story 12. I bartend, and years ago I kicked this guy out because he was acting very strange, muttering under his breath that he would kill my other customers. Just really hostile. He had missing fingers on one hand, and he was kind of a bigger guy. After bar close, I was almost finished counting money, so like an hour after everyone left, and I was just about to leave, and I had that gut feeling. I looked out the window, and that guy was standing on the corner watching me in a ski mask. I know it was him because of the build. As soon as I grabbed my phone, he took off, but the cops know who he is. Now he has a vendetta out against me, and he's well known around town. He's frickin' nuts. Story 13. I stopped by a friend's house to watch a ball game. His wife and I were just relaxing, and someone knocked on the door. It was the middle of the afternoon. He opened it up. He was expecting others might come by also. I hear him greeting someone. The guy was his brother I had never met, but had heard about. Very sketchy-looking guy, meth teeth, scrawny, long, greasy hair. My friend had told me that he had a brother who lived in the area who had a serious drug problem. Buddy is talking to his brother about nothing, and the guy gets a call on his cell, whoever called. All he told them was, "Not yet, I'll call you later." Seems pretty obvious this guy has come to rob and most likely to take out witnesses. I look at my buddy. It seems he has come to the same conclusion. Now, my buddy's wife is a no-nonsense type of woman, sweet but athletic. On the tall side, she had left the room to go to the bathroom, or so she said. She comes back in the room with a handgun. I'm thinking, WTF did I walk into? But she calmly says, "Ron, you're strung out and came here with bad intentions. You need to quietly leave, if you get any ideas." Chris, their son, is sitting outside in his truck to make sure you go.
Ron doesn't say a word. He just turns and goes out the door. We can hear his old pickup drive away rapidly. Chris come in and says, "He's gone. I don't think he's coming back." They ask me to leave so they can decide what to do. They have already called the police, who are well acquainted with Ron. The next morning, my buddy calls me. The police said they found his brother in the trailer park where he lived, murdered with multiple gunshots. They are guessing he was in serious drug debt and had come to rob his brother. I told my buddy I was sorry. He said, "Don't be." Story 14. Sitting in my friend's backyard with their 2 kids, my husband, and another friend, enjoying pizza that my host made. It was a beautiful, clear day with no real wind. We're having a great time just out of the pool and hungry for pizza, when I suddenly felt on edge. I looked straight at the kids, about 8 and 10 or so years old, and just said, "Get in the house." We all scramble, and a second later we heard creaking, and maybe 5 seconds after it started, this big branch fell off of their pine tree onto the table where we were sitting. Thankfully, no one was hurt besides having to pick pine needles out of our pizza. I can only assume that I subconsciously heard the branch starting to give. Story 15. When we were in our teens, my sister and I were walking our dog in our local forest area very close to our childhood home. We were about to leave and had just clipped our dog back up when a lady appeared out of nowhere and started chatting to us. She was odd. She told us her dog would love some socialization with our dog and could we go back with her for 5 minutes. What I hadn't clocked, but my sister had, was that her dog was nowhere to be seen. The lady was almost rounding us up to head back towards the forest when, little did I know, my sister had spotted a van out of the corner of her eye. I was still oblivious at this point. Suddenly, my sister screams, "Dad!" And to our luck, my dad had finished work and was now out on a run. He starts waving and running towards us, and as we turn back around, the lady had vanished. My sister looks back over at the van and sees the lady closing the passenger door and it speeding off. Dog still nowhere to be seen. I believe we were minutes away from abduction. It was divine intervention that my dad happened to be at the right place at the right time. Story 16. Wednesday midday. Run along a beautiful river pathway near my apartment block. About 1 kilometer in, I felt people watching me and directly turned around and ran home, even though I did not see anybody. Closed the 2 magnetic gates leading up to my door and didn't see anybody around or follow me. About 10 minutes later, 2 guys were at my front door trying to push it in. I was luckily on the other side of the door at that moment and pushed it back closed with all my force and began screaming. I managed to security lock the front door and text my apartment block for help. I was on the 2nd floor, and they obviously watched which apartment I went into. Looking back at the apartment's security cameras, they were able to see the 2 guys pull apart the magnetic security gates, 2 of them. The block then quickly changed the gates to a mechanic lock that cannot be pulled apart. Story 17. My brother and I were kids, playing hide-and-seek in the front yard of our house. My brother was 3 and I was 6. My brother was supposed to be counting and finding me, but he was taking forever, so I peeked around the side of the house to see what was taking so long. He had lost interest in the game and was standing near the front gate, which led to the street. As I'm looking, I see a brown car pull up with 2 men inside. The car wasn't familiar, and neither were the men. They both got out of the car and approached my brother. They started asking him questions and moving closer to him. I remember feeling panicked. I had learned about stranger danger in school and knew this wasn't right. I ran around the side of the house, flew through the back door, and screamed, "Someone is trying to kidnap Steve." My dad didn't hesitate. He got up and flew through the front door. When the men saw my dad coming through the door, they bolted and peeled out. From that day forward, we weren't allowed to play in the front yard anymore. It's a really scary memory for me. Story 18. When I was around 5 or 6, I was in my front yard and this car drove up and the driver wanted to know where the street was. I pointed that it's down there. He asked me where. I said down there and pointed. It was a side street, maybe about 100 yards away or so. He asked where again and told me to come closer to the car and pointed out. At that point, something clicked in my brain and I just screamed, "Daddy!" And that guy peeled off and drove away. Story 19. Does an "I need to go home now" feeling count? And it wasn't me, but my mom. Anyway, I was around 12 or so, and my mom left to run an errand, leaving me alone. Very soon after she left, the doorbell rang. This was weird because we lived on a hill with only 2 neighbors. We all kept to ourselves. And we just didn't get random visitors. Thanks to some conveniently placed picture frames, I could see out the door without being seen. I look out and see a young man I don't recognize. He's dressed in a shirt and jeans, and something just feels off. So I ignore him and wait for him to leave. But he doesn't. He lingers and starts smoking. Again, this is an isolated hill, I'm alone, and now I'm getting scared. I go and hide and plan to wait for my mom. Except she just left, had a few errands to run, and I couldn't reach the phone without the guy seeing me, as I'm trying to figure out what to do. My mom comes home. She runs in and asks if I'm okay. Apparently, she got this random go home now urge. She hadn't even run her first errand yet, but turned around immediately, found the guy in our yard and asked what he needed. I guess he muttered something about looking for someone, or something to that effect, and my mom told him to leave. Apparently, he was acting very strangely and made my mom nervous. To this day, I have no idea what he wanted, and no idea how my mom knew to come home. But I am very grateful she did.
Story 20. Back in 2019, me, my husband, and 2 girls aged 6 and 9 were on a road trip in the South. We had booked an apartment in Atlanta through Airbnb without knowing the neighborhood at all. It was bad, really sketchy, with a lot of creepy-looking people hanging around. We went into the apartment, and immediately my 6-year-old said, "I don't like it here." The door didn't lock properly. The beds were dirty, there was rotting food in the fridge, and the bathroom had not been cleaned in ages. My husband called the owner, who was furious and refused to give us a refund. To de-escalate the situation, my husband offered to not leave a negative review if we could just get our money back. The owner agreed, but asked us to wait for him so that they could talk about it in person. As soon as he hung up, I told my husband that we needed to leave now. We hurried to the car, and as we pulled out of the parking garage, we saw the owner driving up with 4 friends. He didn't see us, and we bolted out of there. Ended up at a hotel on the 14th floor, didn't even feel safe at street level. Story 21. A friend called me and said, "There's a wildfire 8 miles away. Can you help me move my horses?" So I drove down. She was wrong. It was 8 miles by car. Under 2 as the crow flies. We got the first set of horses out and down to another farm. The second set I'm working on, and suddenly, things get quiet. It's as if the world stopped for a minute. I look at the horse, and the horse looks like it's ready to run. I take a deep breath, and suddenly, the noise comes back. The wind is hot as fuck, and the light changes. I told Sherry, the girl I'm helping, "We gotta go now! No time to shove the horses into the trailer. They are smart enough to survive." And I let them loose. We run to the truck, and the barn is already on fire. Then, we get in the truck and notice the fire past us, and is blocking the road. So, we jump out and ran to a small pond for the horses, and we dive in, hoping the fire doesn't burn us. It was about 20 minutes of hell. It might have been longer, I don't know. It was insanely scary, hot and loud. We got rescued by the fire department's water-dropping helicopter. It landed in the field and pulled us in. We got lucky. The truck was burned to the frame, and the horse Sherry let go died. The one I let go survived, but was burned. That's most likely the scariest moment. Story 22. I was freshly married in my early 20s, living in Fallbrook, California. My husband, ex, was a Marine and was at work, and I was driving home from visiting family further south. To get into Fallbrook, you have to travel along this long, dark, and windy street called Mission Road. It's already a super dark night, about 11 p.m., and it's a little foggy as well. I'm slowing down and coming around this slight bend in the road, and all of a sudden the hair goes up on my neck, and I feel incredibly anxious. About 5 seconds later, a young woman jumps out of the brush directly ahead of me, maybe 50 feet away, on the left-hand side of the road while waving her arms in the air and gesturing frantically for me to pull over. I swerved a bit to the right, slowing down even further, but I did not stop. She was young, maybe early 20s or even late teens, and a little dirty, and I was immediately conflicted over continuing to drive. But something told me not to stop under any circumstances. I got further up the road, slowed a little more, and dialed 911 with one shaky hand. The dispatcher said she'd send someone to check, but encouraged me not to feel badly. Apparently, there had already been calls about this girl over the last hour, and they were unable to find her when police followed up. I heard a few weeks later about some carjacking/robbery attempts in the area. Very relieved I listened to my instincts that night. Story 23. I was at the state fair with my mom and my best friend. Friend and I were looking at the rides and the games.
This creepy guy and his blonde girlfriend kept babbling at us about taking headshots and that he was a modeling agent. He just seemed off and really sleazy, and the girl was giving me the creeps, so I pretended that I saw my mom telling us to come and grabbed my friend and dragged her off. She was close to 5, 8, and not a small girl at 13 years old. I was 4, 9, and around 65 pounds at 14 years old. A few days later, there's a news story and rumors going around the school about 2 girls being kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered. They were taken from the fair the same day we were there, just a few hours later. The creepy couple were Gerald and Charlene Gallegos, serial killers.
Story 24. I was walking down the street in a very unfamiliar city with a group of friends. I got this feeling and didn't know how to articulate it, so I said to the group, "Hey, I've got to use the restroom. Can we just duck inside this subway real quick? I promise I'll be quick." About a minute later, there was a shootout just up the block. If we wouldn't have gone into the restaurant, we would have all been standing right in the middle of the incident waiting to cross the street. Story 25. I was at a family gathering, basically a reunion, but just for family within reasonable driving distance, probably 30 people altogether. It was at County Park on a small lake with some grills and buildings, just an empty hall with some picnic tables inside you could rent for this kind of stuff. The sky started darkening as a storm was approaching. All the coolers, chairs, balls, and other kids' toys, etc., were brought into the building, anticipating the rain. The plan was to wait it out since afternoon showers are common just about every day in the summer. Something in the air didn't feel or smell right, even though it appeared to be just a regular afternoon storm. Hair on my neck was standing up, and I was in full flight mode. I can't really describe it. The feeling in the pit of my stomach can only be described as absolute dread. I told my wife to take my daughter and get in the car. My brother-in-law took one look at my face and said, "What's wrong?" Apparently, I was white as a ghost. It wasn't even raining yet, and I was full on panic, yelling for everyone to leave. Something isn't right. No one else was that worried, mostly concerned with how I was acting. I went out to the car, and as soon as I was about to turn the key, the tornado sirens went off. We were not far from wherever they put those, or they are just stupidly loud, because it was deafeningly loud. Now the rest of the family is pouring out of the building to their cars, kids crying, and I look across the lake, maybe a few miles in the distance, and see a funnel cloud. Got the hell out of there, as did everyone else. The building we had rented for this family barbecue thing was completely annihilated, literally just a slab of concrete and a shit ton of debris all around. It was hit dead on by an EF3. Story 26. I live in an area where tornadoes aren't common. One day there was a big storm coming. Weather Channel is giving a tornado watch, which in the past, I never put much stock into. I don't know why, but this time was different. I was sitting in my recliner with my German Shepherd at my feet, watching the news closely. I felt, for some reason, I should wrangle my cats and put them in their carriers in the basement. Worst case scenario, I figure, nothing happens and they spend 30 minutes in their carriers. No big deal. I go back to my recliner to continue watching the news when the sky suddenly turns green. Everything feels wrong and surreal. I tell my wife to get in the basement, and I pick up my shepherd and carry all 105 pounds, him kicking and screaming, down the narrow basement steps. My feet hit the basement floor, and the pressure suddenly drops. We hear a thunderous roar, and the windows upstairs shatter. It felt like an eternity in the 30 seconds it lasted. Then, there was nothing. I creep upstairs and peek out the basement door to find every window blown out. The recliner where I had been sitting not 3 minutes prior was completely covered in shards of glass, which I would have taken to the face if I hadn't hauled ass. It turned out the tornado went directly over our house. Windows were destroyed, the roof was destroyed, the fence was completely gone, the porch ripped from the house, trees down absolutely everywhere. I'll never forget how something in my gut said to take it seriously, and listening to it saved my life. Story 27. When I was around 9 or 10, my mom took me with her on a business trip to a nearby city. This is before smartphones, when you still had to MapQuest stuff. We were supposed to meet my mom's friend's coworker at the mall for something. Since her friend had given her directions, we didn't bother going down to the hotel computer to print directions. I think there was maybe one there. This was around 2000 to 2001. We got lost and ended up pulling into a small storage unit place to pull out a map. It was just 2 rectangular buildings, maybe a total of like 20 units. I don't remember why, exactly, but I was really scared and kept crying and asking if we could just go back to the hotel. I assume she got fed up with her kid crying in the passenger seat, and she couldn't quite figure out where we were, so we went back to the hotel.
The next day, they found the bodies of 2 teenagers in one of the units we pulled in front of. Story 28. In college, I was studying at my school's business school building, waiting to meet a friend, and I had a sudden sense of dread. I texted my friend that I would just meet her at her dorm later instead of meeting at the business school, and I left to walk to a nearby library instead. When I got to the library about 20 minutes later, I checked my phone and I had nearly 20 missed calls and texts from my friends who knew I was at the business building. Literally seconds after I left, a student entered the building and stabbed multiple people, killing one professor and injuring several students. It happened in the room I had just been in.
Story 29. When I was a kid and I was skateboarding on my street and the exact same thing happened, a guy asked where a certain street was. I said, somewhere down there, and pointed randomly. He says, "Can you get in and show me?" My dad had given me the full-blown stranger danger talk after a letter got dropped in our letterbox saying there was a child molester in the street. I started screaming, "Child molester! Child molester! Help! Help!" The guy peeled rubber big time out of there. Story 30. When I was a teenager, me and some friends were hanging out around midnight. A caravan drives past slowly, with a few people looking out the windows. We all look at each other quietly, and the caravan pulls into a nearby parking space. We all get up and walk to our bikes, because something feels really off. A few minutes later, we hear someone shout, and as I turned around, there were about 5 or 6 people getting out with metal pipes and other things in their hands. We ran so fast, nothing happened, but I'm 99% sure we were about to get beaten and robbed. Story 31. I had a 9-month-old baby at home and didn't go out much, and one of my friends was in from out of town and asked if I wanted to see a band, whose members were people I knew socially from college. I said, sure, that'll be fun. I met her and a bunch of people at a bar across the street before the show and had a nice time, but got a feeling that I should go home. My husband was at home with our baby and wanted me to have fun, and I was, but I had a bad feeling to just leave. I said my goodbyes and left. There was a shooting at the bar that night. No one I knew was hurt, but they were locked in the bar for hours, and it was terrifying for them. I'm glad I trusted my instincts. Story 32. I was hammock camping while riding my motorcycle through Arkansas. I had a dream that I was getting pulled over by the cops on my bike. The flashing lights were super bright in my eyes, and as I woke from my dream, I noticed my blue hammock tent was lighting up like flashing police lights. I immediately felt an adrenaline spike and went into full flight mode. Packed my shit up faster than I could even put my boots on. Hopped on my bike in my underwear and rode a mile to the top of the campground where the showers were. The second I stepped into the shower cabin, the sky opened up, and cloud-to-ground lightning started striking trees in the campground every 10-15 seconds. I could have been royally destroyed by a lightning strike had I stayed sleeping between 2 of them. Story 33. I was an infantry platoon leader in Afghanistan. One night we were on a foot patrol along the outskirts of a town where we were concerned about Taliban activity. I decided to move in closer to get a look at the place, without worrying about the people of the town coming and going, which is always stressful. It was about 3 a.m., so everyone was asleep. It was completely silent. My interpreter carried an FM radio that he used to monitor non-secure traffic, which is how the Taliban tended to communicate back then. We hear something in Pashto on his radio, and he very calmly turns to me and says, "Sir, they are saying the ambush is set." I immediately got on my radio and told my squad leaders to halt, and we pulled back and got the hell out of Dodge. That was probably the most pucker I have felt in combat. I am convinced that interpreter saved several lives that night, and when he messaged me during the fall of Kabul asking if I could get his family out, I called every contact I could think of to make sure he got on a flight. They currently live in Seattle, where he works in IT. Story 34. Years ago, I was at a club with some friends. I was at the bar, and, for some reason, looked down at the other end of the bar and saw 2 guys quietly arguing. They tried to keep from being overheard, but I saw their agitated faces. I went back to my group of friends and told them we should go. This was a popular club, and it took us forever to get in, so they didn't want to leave. I don't know what came over me, but I picked up my friend's girlfriend, she was barely 5 tall, and started walking to the door. She was kicking the entire time, and the rest of the party followed me outside, telling me to put her down. When we got outside, we heard the distant pop pop and people screaming. We looked at each other for a second, then ran for our cars. I forgot to put her down and was still carrying her over my shoulders. Story 35. About 1.5 years ago, I got out of a concert hall and I was with my friend with benefits, her friend and her friend's boyfriend.
We walked across the busy street to a bar, 2:30 a.m. around this time, got a quick tequila shot and a drink to end the night, and we left to call the Uber. We were sitting on the side of the road on a curb waiting for the Uber, and there was a group of people that walked to our side. They just looked like bad news, and they were just looking to cause problems. I look at my friend, with benefits, and pulled her up. She looks at me like, "What the fuck?" at first, and then she saw the "we need to get the fuck out" look in my eyes, so she turned around and said, "We are going," to the other two. Once we got up, not 5 seconds later, bang, 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 and I felt like I got a painful splinter in the back of my leg, but we ran to the cop car across the street to get some cover. Turns out, I got a fragment of the curb that we were sitting on where the bullet hit exactly where we were sitting in my calf. It was a wild shot that just happened to hit where we were sitting. Unfortunately, someone died that night, and my gut feeling saved my friends or myself from a fatal gunshot that wasn't even intended for us. The only reason I knew about a piece of stone embedded in my leg, and it wasn't just a muscle pull from running, was because a cop responding, and running by us while we were standing behind the cop car, and he saw blood on my leg and thought I got shot. A quick statement, an ER visit to fish out the half-marble-sized shard of stone in my calf, while absolutely wasted, and I was on my way home at 6 a.m. I didn't really put it all together until I got home thinking, "Holy shit, I can't believe I'm alive right now." Story 36. I was a high school teenager around 13. I'm petite and look way younger, so looked at least 10/11ths. I was in my school uniform on my way to school, and our local shopkeeper stops me. He starts talking to me as usual and asks me what my plans are for the day. I look down at my uniform and tell him I'm going to school. He asks me if there's anything interesting happening, and I responded with, "As a matter of fact, we have a mini trip for my geography class." So he offers me a few snacks, which I declined. Now, the reason I declined it was because he was speaking to me from the back door of the shop and asked me to come to the back storeroom to collect the free snacks. I started feeling really strange and declined and said, "I have to go, I'm getting late." He then asked me for my number, and I got freaked out and said I don't have a phone and ran. I remember him shouting something at me, but I was too scared to hear him out. When I got back from school, I told my parents about it, and my father went storming to the shop to confront him. Well, the coward of a man hid while the owner of the shop apologized. It made me wonder, if I was a naive teenager who actually walked in for the free snacks, thinking he was being friendly, what would this grown man have done to me? Keep in mind, he looked like he was in his early 30s, and I was 13 in my school uniform, looking like a 10-year-old. I've had a few close calls as a young girl, but this one stood out the most to me. Story 37. I was camping in eastern Arizona with a friend of mine. We like to hike in this particular area that's fairly isolated. We found a place, probably 14 or 15 miles deep into the forest, on small quad bike trails, and set up camp for the night. We put out our fire and go into our tents. Probably about 15 minutes go by. I'm reading a book on my phone, and what can I only describe as a roar sounds like it's about 50 feet away from our campsite. Never in my life have I been so terrified. I had immediate goosebumps and went into full panic mode. My friend and I both get out of our tents, look around, and don't see anything because it's dark as hell, but run as fast as we can and just hop in the car. Immediately drove off and found a motel about an hour drive away. I will never forget that sound. I've seen bears in real life and looked up what a bear roar sounds like, and it was nothing like it. The one we heard was almost high-pitched and just filled me with immediate dread. No clue to this day what it was, but I'm glad we noped the hell out of there. We came back the next day, and everything was as we left it, other than the coals in the fire were spread around a bit. There was no wind that night, so I don't know what happened. I haven't gone back to that area since, and I have no desire to. Whatever made that noise definitely didn't want us there. Story 38. I'm a teenage girl who worked at a restaurant/pizza shop. I was harassed by these two men one weekend who were totally wasted, so they were kicked out. The following weekend they returned, and they tried to sit next to me at the counter, which is connected to the bar, but they couldn't, so they chose a table across from me and moved both their seats to look right at me. Then, they would only order from my counter instead of our waitresses, were staring at me, making jokes about killing a girl and kind of just freaking me out. I ended up going to our upstairs employees-only section to fold boxes, up there all alone down a hallway where nobody would hear me. I ended up feeling sick to my stomach as I heard someone walk up the stairs and whispering, and I closed the door and turned my music off and texted my mom. The two followed me up there, then tried to go down the unlocked hallway, but another waitress noticed them bothering me and caught them trying to come after me. I just had a gut feeling, as I heard them coming, and she came down the hallway and told me to be quiet and hold our body weight against the door. We waited for them to leave as they stood there, waiting for me to come out before making some remarks about not knowing where I was, then going back down. My dad came and picked me up early because I just felt so off. The following day, I had to come in for another shift, and as I was clocking out, the TVs started playing a true crime documentary on a girl with the same name as me who was kidnapped and assaulted by two men. My stomach dropped, and shortly after that I gave my notice. I realized I wasn't going to be protected there and wouldn't be surprised if they returned again. Story 39. My little brother and I were tossing a baseball around near dusk at the bottom of our property, 30 wooded mountain acres way in the middle of nowhere. It had gotten dark enough that we were just about to call it quits when we heard the single most horrifying scream we've ever heard coming from the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. Imagine a woman screaming in mortal agony, writhing in the most wretched torment imaginable. Every tortured scream from horror movies, war movies, anything you've ever heard. Nothing compared to this. Even now, decades removed from hearing it, the hair on my arms and neck stands up just thinking of it, and it's made even worse by the realization of what it actually was. A mountain lion. Full-grown female mountain lions scream loudly when they're in heat, and it sounds like a human woman being torn to pieces by the devil himself. To hear that, two kids alone in the dark in the middle of nowhere, was about as terrifying as it gets. I grabbed his arm and ran scrambled fear levitated up the hill faster than ever before or since. It's been 25 years, and I still haven't fully unpuckered. Story 40. Many years ago, I went with my then-girlfriend to one of her female friends' houses, who was married to a guy I'd never met before. I'll call them Jack and Jill, so I can tell the story a little easier. We played cards with them for a couple hours, and it was a good time besides an odd feeling I had the whole time I was there. Something just didn't sit right with me being there with them in their home. The best I can explain it is that I was having an anxiety nervous-like feeling, but having no reason to feel that way. After leaving, I told my girlfriend the feeling I had and that I didn't think we should go back there again because something wasn't right. Fast forward several months to a year or so later, I forget the exact timeline, Jack murders Jill in that same home, Mag dumping her with his semi-automatic pistol before killing himself with one of the last rounds. No motive. Really horrible stuff that sent shockwaves through the community, and it's the only time I've ever had that feeling. Story 41. When I was maybe 5, 6, I went to the grocery store with my mom. I hated standing in line with her, so I'd always beg her to let me go wait on the bench in front of the store like a big girl. I went out to the bench once, and there was a woman standing near it smoking. She came up to me and said, "Wow, you have such pretty eyes." I just stared and said nothing, because she really irked me for some reason. Then she reached for me and said she just wanted to touch my curls. I hated people touching my hair, so I dodged my head to the side and locked eyes with a guy in a van idling by the curb, watching us. I never saw her get out of his van, so I really had no reason to assume they were together, but something about both of them terrified me. I remember gulping in the biggest breath I could and just shrieking. Not yelling for help, just a long, ear-piercing scream. It was a small shop, and the registers were just inside the door, so everyone heard me and started rushing out. The woman hopped in the van at lightning speed, and they took off. Story 42. My ex had been planning to have me killed and make it look like a home invasion. His behavior had shifted in a very odd way the week before. I found out later he had a woman pregnant behind my back and had planned to move her in and ship my kids off to the state. Their dad is already dead. He wanted to collect my life insurance. I got up right after he left for work that early morning, got dressed in the first things I could grab, woke up my kids and told them we just had to go. I told them not to ask questions right then, that we just had to leave. The door that led from our garage to the inside of our house was always religiously locked. That night it had been left unlocked. In the weeks leading up to this, our security alarm had been bypassed, and he tried to blame my oldest son when my son didn't even know how to do that kind of thing. My husband taught someone else how to do it. Story 43. My wife and I used to live in a rural exurb outside a large metropolitan area. We were on an interstate about halfway between the city and our home when my wife,
who was 6 months pregnant, started having contractions. At the next off-ramp, I turned around and headed back towards the city, planning on heading for an ER. I took the very first exit on the outskirts of the city. It was pretty desolate. The only thing on the 2-lane road were a couple of rock quarries that were empty after dark. There wasn't much light on the winter-darkened evening. I pulled into a gravel turnout just south of the off-ramp, pulled to a stop, leaving the engine running, and turned my full attention to my wife. A few minutes passed before my attention was grabbed by a car parked across the turnout, turning their headlights on with high beams. My wife grabbed my arm and said, "We've got to get out of here." And I was like, "Yeah." So I dropped it in gear and hauled ass down that 2-lane road towards the city. The other car gave chase for a while, but I was flooring my car. I drove a Dodge Stratus. Eventually, we got into civilization, and the other car turned around and ran off. We spent the night in the hospital, narrowly avoiding the premature birth of my son. He's 17 now. We guessed I didn't notice that my headlights were shining on a drug handoff, my attention being on my wife, and it pissed the other people off. But who knows? Crazies are everywhere. Story 44. I've had a few over the years. Rememberable ones are when in the woods with my 1-year-old picking up pine cones. It was about 4 p.m. on a summer's day, so still light and warm. Anyway, suddenly this mixed feeling of dread and fear and of being watched came over me. I just picked him up and ran. The next day, on our local community Facebook group, another mother reported that her and her 2 little girls had been flashed at in the woods, and quite aggressively. Another one was, I was heavily pregnant, I'd went to a hen-do just for the meal, and then was going home. I was about to call a taxi when the bride insisted the limo she hired dropped me home. I thought it was a funny idea for my husband to see me get home in a limo, so I agreed. The driver seemed fine with it, and was a nice, chatty guy. We're driving home when suddenly he starts detouring. We're by the docks, and he starts pulling into some dodgy-ass car park, not saying a word to me. I called my husband in right away, and very loudly told him the situation, and where I was, and that I'd be home in 10 minutes. The driver made some excuse about picking something up from a friend, disappeared for 5 minutes, and then took me home. I'm convinced he had bad intentions. And to this day, the regret and pure fear and feeling so stupid will never ever leave me. Ladies, we are never safe. Never presume you are. Story 45. We were driving back from an impromptu family vacation. My husband and I were both driving cars. Too many people, not enough alert drivers. And I was following him. We were in the left lane passing a truck, and I suddenly had an overwhelming feeling that we needed to slow way down and move over immediately. I called him and told him that we needed to get over, go slower than the truck, and turn our hazards on. He thought I was a little crazy, but he's learned to listen to my gut feelings and did it. Suddenly, we ran into a freak ice storm, and the truck slipped off the road. The car that went past us on the left slid into oncoming traffic, and 3 other cars behind us proceeded to slide off the road. There was a big dip on the side of the road, and one of the cars even tipped over. We somehow came through unscathed and made it home safely. Another time I was driving to work, and I was behind a work van with ladders on top of it. It wasn't particularly busy on the highway, but someone was behind me somewhat close. I had a horrible feeling wash over me that I needed to move over right away. I moved 1 lane over about 15 seconds before one of the ladders flew off the van. It hit the road right next to me, and the car that was behind me ran over it a little, but luckily wasn't impaled or anything. I've had this feeling several times in my life and have even canceled entire vacations over it. I don't know if anything would have happened for several of them, but I truly think I've avoided some serious trouble. Story 46. I was supposed to get off of my retail job at 10 p.m. and catch the first bus I needed to get home. My manager had me stay later, so I had to catch a late bus and change my route since my usual second bus stopped running. I did notice this late bus ride was empty, but the 10 p.m. one was usually pretty full. The stop wasn't my usual spot, so I just sat to wait for the bus. I was texting my best friend and asking her to pick me up because sometimes buses don't show or are late. She wasn't answering me since she ended up working late too. And then I noticed my surroundings. I was just off of a main street, just south of several closed corner stores. I realized this bus bench was on the street nearest to a park that closes at sundown. There were no cars and no people. The streetlight near the bus stop was busted too. I immediately felt unnerved and trapped. Nothing was open, and nothing was nearby. A man was walking towards the bench I was waiting on. He was walking from the park.
He would pass under a street lamp and be illuminated, and then disappear before being lit up by the light again. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. He came up behind the bench and didn't sit down next to me, just stood behind the bench, slightly to my right. Then he started walking around the bench, just circling me. I called my friend and acted like she had answered, but instead I left a voicemail. "Hey, you almost here?" "Yep, I'm still here. I'll hop in as soon as you pull up." "Wanna grab food?" "Nah, we had McDonald's last week." The dude kept circling me. I was too afraid to even look at his face. I hung up and put my phone away and realized I had my box cutter in my bag. I pulled it out and started playing with it, just pushing the blade in and out. He stopped circling me, and I finally looked at him and stood up. He turned north and walked away. My friend pulled up soon after. We drove right past the guy who was still walking aimlessly. I bought a car about a week later, and I always drove my coworkers home if we worked late together and they needed a ride.
Story 47. My great-grandma lives at the far end of a neighborhood right next to a big, busy street, so there are suspicious characters by her house often. When I was a kid, I visited her every weekend, and one time when I was 11, I was sitting on the living room floor, and I heard these two people arguing in Spanish. I hear a lady screaming at the top of her lungs, and having gone to Arizonan schools all my life, I recognize every cuss word. Curious? I went to the kitchen and peeked through the window which looked out onto the street, and something didn't seem right. I felt like I should duck, and the moment I did, the lady pulls a gun out and starts shooting. The man she was arguing with was out of my view, so I didn't know what happened to him, but I was the only witness to that crime. Story 48, in Iraq, circa 2006. Was on a foot patrol through a muddy area along the Euphrates River. Myself and my team were walking down this pathway in a somewhat open field along the river, and I looked to my left and see a 55-gallon drum laid on its side, and I noticed that we were about to walk parallel to it. I then looked down a bit to my front right and saw a very soft glow coming from the dirt. It was dusk at this point. I turn to my team and say, "I think we need to turn around." And as we start walking away, a big-ass explosion goes from under my feet and launches me through the air. A gunfight ensues as the remaining teammates start shooting back, and I regain my scruples to return fire. After a short while, we contain the scene and look at the crater. The bomb left a crater that was about 8 feet wide and 5 feet deep. The bomb crew people said it was buried too deep and probably why it didn't kill me. The drum on its side was a marking object, so the trigger guy could line us up with the explosive from a distance. The glow I saw was the dusk sunlight glinting off a buried wire that was connected to the bomb. None of my team died or was injured. We turned around just in time. Story 49, picture it, 1994. I was 18 and waitressing in a sports bar. A comedy club was upstairs. One night a comedian kept visiting between sets. He was funny and charming, and he seemed quite smitten with me. He asked me out to late-night breakfast. If you've ever been in hospitality, you know we go out and eat at 3 a.m. I changed after my shift and waited a few minutes for him. I realized I really didn't know this person, and I should not let him in my car. I decided to be smart and GTFO. A few years later, I was absent-mindedly flipping through a People magazine at a friend's house. That is when I saw my comedian date, Vince Champ, had been arrested as a serial rapist. His favorite target was young college girls, and they finally caught him after putting the puzzle together between victims and his campus circuit. Holy shit, I dodged a bullet! I think he may still be in jail. He was that terrible. Story 50. I was at a bar with friends that was on the top floor in a building. I was out on the patio and noticed a couple of fire trucks coming and parking right in front of the building we're in. I immediately told my friends we should go. We went to the elevators, but they wouldn't come, so we took the stairs. Just when we were heading down, we could hear the fire alarms and we could hear others coming down the stairs. We were about 4 flights ahead of them. About halfway down, the lights went off, and we could hear above us people panicking. As we got closer to the exit, smoke filled the stairway. Firemen finally came and helped us the way down. Story 51. I usually tour by myself, split boarding, which means the board you can ski up the hill with skins on the bottom, then you assemble it into a snowboard at the top. Which isn't recommended because you should have a buddy to dig you out if there is an avalanche. Because of that, I stick to terrain I know well and absolutely won't slide. Headed up on a settled day, but something just felt off. Snow was supposed to be stable at this point with recent weather, but it just wasn't acting like it should. Got passed by 2 other guys heading up and decided to turn around. Now that somebody was above me, I felt like it could be triggered out of my control. I was the last person to see these 2 guys before SAR recovered their bodies. Freak avalanche. Story 52. was heading south down 31 North through Indianapolis, and for some reason, the GPS turned us off the main road we figured may be construction. So while off the highway, we decided to get something to eat and go to the bathroom, stopped at a KFC. I went to use the facilities, and came out, looked around a bit, and realized the counter is behind bulletproof windows. Then, also realizing we had seen heavy drug use on the curb of the parking lot, had a couple of guys looking at us, older couple, me using a cane and driving in a rental vehicle, back and forth, not saying anything, just slight nods to each other. All of a sudden, it all clicks into place. I said, "I don't want chicken after all, is that okay?" BF said, "Yeah, we can figure it out later." Walked out slowly, but got in the car and locked it immediately as the ones on the curb started our way as well as the guys in the restaurant. We just took off like a bat out of hell. Our spider senses were way up. Story 53. I grew up in a not-so-great area, which is an understatement, to say the least. When I was a teenager, we were all at stages where a lot of the kids were making the transition from badly behaved teens onto different paths. Some of us realized it was time to get our heads down and stay out of trouble. Others decided to double down and go on to do much worse things. One evening in the summer, a group of us was out in a park, just playing. Because although life was rough and complex, we were still actually children. Every now and then we stopped pretending to be tough-hardened teenagers and just let ourselves have some innocent fun. Over the evening, a few other friends of friends joined. There were a lot of us, but there was a really cool atmosphere. Jokes, fun, and no one was getting up to mischief. We were all just enjoying being young and amongst friends in the sun. I was playing tag with another kid, which was amusing because we were technically too old for that, but still young enough to enjoy it. A couple of other people joined in, and it was all good. As we were running around, I noticed another group of people join, and I stopped. The kid I was with said, "It's fine, I know them," but I felt a whole body chill. I stopped playing around and went over to get the friends I came with to tell them we need to leave, but because the vibe was good, they wanted to stay. I tried to tell them we really need to leave, but all I had was this feeling. The new group was older than us by a few years, and one girl was very vocal. She called over and asked my name. I told her, and then I said to one friend in particular, "We need to leave, now!" She just laughed it off and told me to chill. The girl from the other group walked up to me and had an issue with the fact I was chasing her friend during the game of tag and started shouting at me. I started walking away. Then I felt a slam to my head. The girl had followed me and hit me in the head with a brick. I got to my feet and turned around. Her and all her friends had makeshift weapons, and a few had bats. I don't know if they had arrived with them or they were already in the park somewhere. The weapon that scared me most was a solid plank of wood with rusty nails in it. 3 of them held similar planks. I was hit across my back multiple times with them. Then, when I fell to the ground, they took turns stamping on me. All my friends stayed further away, one screaming my name, others screaming, "Run!" I had always been taught to stand and fight, but as I got to my feet, even I knew it would be silly. There were so many people, and they were all armed in some way, but even if they weren't, I couldn't have fought them all, so I started to run as fast as I could. My legs were shaking like jelly, my thighs burned, I felt so sick they caught up to me 5 times. Beat me to the floor with their weapons, and stamped all over me. Each time I got up and ran as fast as I could. At one point, a boy caught up with me. He was wearing a balaclava, and he said my name as he came up behind me. I recognized him instantly. He was the big brother of one of my best friends. He'd practically been my big brother too since I was about 5. He told me not to let on that he knew me and to keep running, but listen to him as he chased me. He told me about a place they used to hide drugs, and told me to go there and hide in the drug stash area. He told me how to cover myself once I was in there and told me not to come out to anyone else calling my name but him. He told me they would kill me if they caught me. Then he pretended to trip to the floor, and I ran literally as if my life depended on it. I found the hiding place. I curled up in a tiny space and hid myself. I bled from multiple injuries and could barely breathe through broken ribs. I stayed there as a group of people came in and called my name, terrified they'd find me. I stayed there all night until my friend's brother came and got me the next morning. He scooped me up and he cried as he said sorry that he let them do that to me, but he couldn't go against her and he couldn't let her kill me. He took me home and cried again that he was sorry. I've never seen him since. The next day my friend came to see me, and she said, "I'm so sorry I didn't just leave when you asked me to. I was so injured and could barely see through swollen eyes." We never made it back to being friends. A week later, a girl I had grown up with. Literally, I'd spent nights at her family home.
was at every birthday party of her family's. She was there that night too. She didn't join in, but she was another silent friend in a crowd of people that beat me to within an inch of my life, because one girl decided she didn't like me. This childhood friend had avoided me since. One day she came and sat beside me and she said, "Did you call the police?" I said of course I didn't. And I genuinely hadn't. It wasn't the done thing, and I wasn't about to go against rules our environment set. She said she wants to kill you because the police came to her that night. All I could do was shrug. I didn't call the police. A day later, a girl attacked me from behind with a knife. This time I fought back hard. It was one-on-one, and I wasn't going to let myself get hurt like that ever again. I hurt that girl very badly, and I don't regret it. I was lucky she didn't stab me. But somewhere in the tussle, she dropped the knife and it just disappeared to the side somewhere. She was sent by the original girl who attacked me, who was now furious. I had hurt her friend. I felt like it was never going to end unless she found me and killed me. A day after that, my childhood friend approached me again. The girl who had instigated the entire attack on me had been arrested. I stated again really firmly, I did not call the police. For the first time in our friendship, I saw her really cry, and she said to me, "No, I know you didn't." They arrested her because the day before she attacked you, she killed a girl in the same park. She said the girl looked at her funny and tried to take her backpack as payment. The girl refused. The bully girl attacked her and the other girl fought back, so the attacker and her friends beat her up, took her to a body of water in the park, held her down and stood on her head until she drowned, and then threw her backpack in with her. I remember that detail so specifically because I remember realizing it was never about the backpack. She just enjoyed hurting people. I felt the coldest feeling throughout my body. It's hard to articulate what it felt like. My childhood friend looked at me, tears rolling down her cheeks, and she apologized to me and told me I could have been killed too. And to this day, I don't doubt I would have been if I hadn't run and hid. I owe my friend's brother my life, but as I say, we never spoke again. So I never got to thank him. There was only one other time I ignored that gut instinct, and it ended very badly for me, and it's a story I don't want to share. But it's safe to say that now whenever I feel that need to leave, even if it doesn't make sense, I trust it, even if it means leaving alone. Story 54. I was having a coffee outside a small cafe a couple of years ago when suddenly I heard a rhythmic clicking approaching. When I looked up, I saw a guy dressed in a worker uniform, very common in Germany, and he had a box cutter in his hand. He was pushing and pulling the blade inside of it as he walked, hence the clicking sound, and he looked angry. Looking around and pacing in a very aggressive way, he walked past me. Now, this might not seem like a crazy situation, and this never happened to me before or after for now, but I heard my own brain clearly telling me, "Leave now." So I stood up and left instantly. As I was going to turn around the block, I looked back and I saw the guy had turned around at some point and he was back outside the cafe. It's anticlimactic, because I never heard any news or anything, but as I was walking away, I still felt uneasy for 20 minutes. I wonder what happened there because I could see clear as day that I had to leave. And as I said, it never happened before or since.
Story 55. About 3 weeks ago now, I was blackwater diving off the coast of Boynton Beach, Florida. For those that don't know, blackwater diving involves being dumped with a light buoy to drift over hundreds of feet of water in the Gulf Stream at night. The light buoy attracts all sorts of alien critters that come up from the deep to feed, so it's a lot of fun for underwater photographers. Needless to say, as a precaution, all divers must at minimum wear a light on their tank to be seen, and I had accidentally grabbed my blue blinky light. Before I was going to jump in, the captain mentioned that blue blinking lights were used by fishermen to attract big things at night. As a regular shark diver, there's not too much I'm afraid of down there, but something sent a chill down my spine, and I switched my light for a regular green glow stick. That very same night, a legendary blackwater diver was on another boat a couple of miles north and got full-on impaled in the leg by a huge swordfish. The fish ripped the sword out of his leg and then kept beating him with it, the way they hunt for the big squid down deep. Dude had his leg torn up and had to self-rescue himself from about 100 feet of depth. No idea if he'll be able to walk, let alone dive again. Story 56. I was walking back from McDonald's during my 1-hour lunch break when I worked at Walmart, crossing through an empty high school parking lot, school was closed due to remodel, to get to my job faster so I could meet up with my brother, who took lunch 30 minutes into my lunch. Anyway, as I was walking, this random man in his car pulls up beside me. Mind you, I was in my early 20s, and even now in my late 20s, still look like a high school-aged child.
5 feet tall and petite female. Well, this man pulled up beside me as I got onto the sidewalk near a fence and rolled down his window asking me where I was going and all this stuff. I gave the "heading to work, my brother is waiting on me" excuse, and immediately pulled my phone out. So it was in my hand, and stepped even closer to the fence and away from his car. This man starts offering to pay me to get in his car, like saying he'll give me $100 just so he can drop me off at my location. He was very persistent and kept asking. I refused and kept denying him until I finally was able to get off the sidewalk to a location his car couldn't reach, and proceeded to speed walk through the small opening and texted my brother immediately about what happened, and tried to see if my radio to security, I worked directly with asset protection, had a signal to my work from that distance. It didn't. Don't know what that man wanted or why he pulled into a high school parking lot insisting I get in his car, but I'm glad I had my dad telling me to never do that or trust anyone, although I will always regret not getting his license plate number.